Hi everyone, thanks for coming to this LGBT History Month event. It's being hosted by the University's Rainbow Alliance Action Group, of which I'm a member. I'm Damien Shaw and my pronouns are they, them. Just before we get started with Kit's talk, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. So we've got no fire alarms planned during this event, so if the alarm does sound, then we need to leave through the main entrance just round here. If you need the toilets, they're just along the corridor. There's also an accessible and all-gender toilet there. If you're joining on Zoom, all cameras and microphones have been automatically turned off. But if you've got a comment or a question, you can use the question and answer function, and we'll take all of the questions at the end. We're also recording the talk, and it's going to be on the university's YouTube channel in due course. So all that remains is for me to introduce Kit. They're a freelance writer, heritage practitioner, trans awareness trainer and academic, and they'll be speaking to you today about their book. And they'll be covering some of the stories that will show us some of the ways that we can rethink the history of gender. So thanks all for coming, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Kit.
Thanks so much, Damien. And hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Can I say, first of all, please feel extremely free to eat your lunch. I know this is lunchtime, and if you want to eat, I would be wanting to eat if I was in the audience. I've already had my super early lunch because I didn't want to be talking on an empty stomach. So, yeah, eat your lunch if you want. Really nice to be here today. Really nice to be here in York as well. York is really sort of the scene where a lot of the groundwork for this book happened. My partner and I lived here for 5 years, between 2012 and 2017. My partner worked in the NMR Centre in the chemistry department up until very recently. Might have crossed paths with some of you when I was volunteering for the York LGBT History Month charity. And so this is, really a pivotal place for my thinking about trans history, but also for my own trans history. This is where I came out and where I transitioned, and so lovely to be back. Anyway, so I'm going to talk today about this book, Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender. I'm going to talk about sort of some of the key ideas in it, going to do a couple of readings, and also talk a bit about the behind-the-scenes story of how the book came to be and what the key kind of driving forces behind it were. So, to sort of set the scene, I want to read to you from the very beginning of the book. On the night of Monday, the 8th of June, 1847, John Sullivan was drunk. Strolling unsteadily down the street in Aldgate, East London, the 22-year-old was wearing a bonnet, a gown, a silk apron, a pair of trousers, and a pair of women's boots. Police Constable Henry Pye's attention was caught both by this attire and by the bundle that John was carrying under one arm. Steering John to the local police station, he opened the bundle to find more items of women's clothing. Where, he asked John, had these come from? John said, "They're mine." 6 days later, on the 14th of June, John Sullivan was tried for the theft of a cape, a handkerchief, an apron, 2 gowns, 2 petticoats, and a pair of stays. The clothes belonged to local woman Frances Norton and has a total value of 13 shillings and sixpence. Under oath, John denied stealing the clothes and dismissed the choice to wear them as a drunken joke, swearing, "I had them given to me to carry to the market. The policeman caught me, and the person who gave me the things ran away. I had a gown on in a lark, but I had my trousers on. I was very much intoxicated." The court, mindful that this was John's second offence, following a 6-month prison sentence the previous year for a crime whose records don't appear to survive, was unsympathetic. John Sullivan was sentenced to be transported to Australia for 10 years. Is this story part of trans history? It's unlikely that many people would treat it as such. John Sullivan lived before the word transgender, as we use it now, was widely available for individuals to describe their actions or identities. There's no evidence that John presented as female outside of the specific circumstances outlined in the trial records. And perhaps most conclusively, those trial records give us John's own testimony, framing the choice to wear women's clothes not as a matter of identity, but as a drunken lark. And surely there's no better metric by which to judge a historical person's gender than their own voice. These are the criteria that usually determine whether trans people feel able to talk about someone as belonging to trans history. We look for evidence that their motivation for gender nonconformity was not external but internal, ideally in the form of personal testimony. We look for continuous presentation as the gender opposite to the one they were assigned at birth. And we look for histories that we can fit into contemporary Western ideas of what it means to be trans. And in the end, even if all those criteria are met, we get anxious if the person we're dealing with lived before the advent of the terminology that we use to talk about trans identity today. And often, this in itself is enough to dismiss their trans possibility altogether. These criteria often make it difficult for us to talk about trans history at all. What makes this conversation even more difficult to have are the concepts that underpin it: gender and sex, internal and external motivations, personal testimony, stability of identity. If we poke at any one of these concepts, the whole edifice starts to crumble. When we talk about trans history, what are we even talking about? This book is about the answer to that question. Now, that is perhaps, I guess, the most fundamental thing about Before We Were Trans, is it's a book about trans history that is trying to change our view of what trans history is. And when I was writing it, I really, wanted to be able to move the conversation about trans history beyond the people that we might think of as sort of the usual suspects. Like if you go to a talk like this, you might be used to coming across, people like Lily Elber on the left, James Barry in the middle, Christine Jorgensen on the right. These are all people who articulated clearly that they had a stable, binary gender that was the opposite of the one they were assigned at birth, and who went on to live like that until they died. And these were, if you like, the kind of easy stories from trans history. But by wheeling out these stories again and again, we build up and we reinforce a really narrow idea of trans history, which privileges histories that are recent, genders that are binary, people's experiences that are medicalised, and also, as I'll go on to say more about later, overwhelmingly white histories as well. And so in Before We Were Trans, I wanted to look at the stories that we don't tell. And I wanted to tackle head-on all of the factors that make those stories difficult. Because stories like the story of John Sullivan that I just told, they really exemplify the problems that very commonly plague stories of gender nonconformity in the past. So there's the problem of terminology and concepts. So, John is from a society that didn't have the word transgender. John probably understood the relationship between gender and the body and clothing very differently from how we do today. And that problem tends to dissuade us from using words like transgender or any of the words in the LGBTQ+ acronym to refer to historical episodes like that. There's the problem of testimony. Now, one of the things that we look for in our contemporary society as evidence of trans identity is personal testimony from the person concerned. Like, as trans people, we are expected to provide personal testimony about our identities to access medical care, or to access legal gender recognition, or to access just basic respect for the validity of our identities. That is what we have come to believe is a standard criteria for judging whether someone is really trans or not, is that personal testimony. But in the case of John Sullivan, and indeed the vast majority of gender non-conforming people from history, we don't have much evidence of how they thought or felt about their gender. For John, we don't have much evidence of how they thought or felt about wearing a dress. The only evidence we've got is from a legal context, which was not a low-stakes context where John would be incentivized to speak freely. It was a context where John was at really high risk of prosecution and of social censure as well, because the idea of quote-unquote cross-dressing was at the time associated with sex between men, which was against the law. And in that testimony we do have, of course, John is saying, I was just wearing this dress because I was drunk, this was a joke. The story of John Sullivan, and again a lot of other stories of gender nonconformity from the past, also exemplifies the problem of stability. Because what we have in the evidence from the court records is a temporary experience of gender nonconformity. So we don't have any evidence that John wore dresses at other times. We don't have any evidence that John had a stable identity that was different from the one they were assigned at birth. And again, that feels kind of at odds with how we define a real trans identity today. We don't tend to think someone counts as really trans if they just put on clothing associated with a different gender for one evening and then they take it off again. And we tend to be cautious, really, even if someone's like done that for a year and then they stop. We're very bad at associating fluidity with realness. And then finally, the other problem that this episode poses is the problem of separating gender from other factors in terms of motivations. And what I mean by this is when we come to looking at gender nonconformity in the past and saying this is trans history and this isn't, one of the deciding factors we often look for is the evidence that the gender nonconformity was definitely just motivated by gender. So like if we've got someone assigned female at birth who presented as a man as part of joining the army, unless we've got evidence that they said, I identified as male, we tend to assume, oh, well, they could have been doing it just to get a job or just to access kind of opportunities that you couldn't otherwise access if you were living as a woman. And so we dismiss the possibility that we could interpret that through a trans lens. And likewise with John Sullivan, it's not clear that wearing a dress was motivated by gender necessarily. It could have been play or theatricality or sexuality, wanting to signal that you want to sleep with a man. Any of those could also have been motivations that fed into it. And so these are all problems that, especially when you take them together, they tend to be enough to stop us talking about stories like John Sullivan's in terms of trans history altogether. But in this book, I wanted to ask, okay, so these are the problems we have. What is it that makes these problems in the first place? Why do these issues of terminology and testimony, instability and motivations kind of have such power to make us feel like we can't talk about histories like John Sullivan's as trans history? And I think that one really important answer to that question comes from our contemporary political environment. Because trans history is very heavily politicised, especially in the UK at the moment. And among the onslaught of hostile media coverage that we've seen over the past sort of 5 to 8 years, really since the UK government proposed reforming the Gender Recognition Act in 2017, there has been one key narrative that has underpinned a lot of transphobic arguments, and that has been, this is a new thing. Here are some lovely headlines for you. My favourite is truly shameful modern invention. I'm going to get that on a t-shirt at some point. But these are all, what underpins a lot of these transphobic arguments is the idea that there is no trans history. And so people argue that more people are transitioning now, which is true, more people are transitioning now, but people argue that that's not because of kind of increased visibility or more legal equality in some places, but because it's a new trend. And so that means, first of all, that our identities shouldn't be taken seriously, and second of all, that we're a new threat, and so we need new laws to protect society from us. And if we look at all the other terms in which these arguments about there being no trans history are articulated, we see that these people are not just saying trans people are new. What they're saying is trans people are new, and that means they're not real. And by doing that, by linking history with realness, with validity, they've tapped into one of the most profound problems facing trans communities today. Because we are living in an environment created essentially by these transphobic campaigners, in which basic respect for trans identities is dependent on us proving the realness and the seriousness of our identities. And all of the structures for proving that realness and proving that validity are built around all those things that I said earlier. So they're built around us giving first-person testimony, they're built around our genders being stable, they're built around us proving that our desire to live as a different gender is definitely motivated just by our identity and not by like wanting to do different things or by our sexuality or anything like that. And those are the ways in which we prove that our genders are real. Those are the ways in which, again, we get medical treatment, we get legal gender recognition, we get respect. And even our defenders in the end talk in those terms. If you go to protests or you engage in any kind of trans allyship context, you will hear people talking about trans men are real men, trans women are real women, non-binary people are valid. And it's not that feeling valid isn't useful and important and valuable, but this constant equation of what it means to be valid with having a stable gender and no fluidity and feeling really clear about what's going on for you and separating your gender from every other aspect of your identity. This is a problem for many trans people today who don't fit into that mould, and it is also really, really profoundly limiting when we are thinking about history. It limits the histories we feel equipped to think of as trans histories, and it limits the histories that we feel able to share. When someone says trans people are new, do we feel able to bring up the vast wealth of histories of gender nonconformity that we have? Or do we mostly stick to the safe histories like Lily Elder from the early 20th century, because we know that she meets all those criteria and she won't make anybody question the validity of her gender? So to put that kind of more simply, our contemporary narrow ideas about what makes someone really trans and our contemporary trans anxieties about that are bleeding into the way that we approach history. And I think understanding trans history in a different way starts with recognising that that's what's going on. Because the thing is, with a story like John Sullivan's, right, yeah, it poses a load of problems, but it also gives us a really interesting spectrum of different gender possibilities. So different ways we could interpret that story. Maybe we interpret John as a man who was wearing a dress in the street and still feeling perfectly masculine. That's cool, because that shows us that Victorian ideals of masculinity and femininity were less rigid than we might expect, and more open to experimentation than we might think. Being able to still feel totally masculine when you're wearing a dress, is something that we shouldn't underestimate. Maybe, on the other hand, we interpret John as a man who put on a dress and then felt a bit more feminine as a result. And this shows us that masculinity and femininity didn't have to be associated with different sorts of body in the Victorian period. So that's also interesting. Maybe we interpret John as someone who usually identified as a man but then put on a dress and felt a bit more like a woman, or a bit more like someone who wasn't a man or a woman. Or maybe we think about John as someone who didn't identify as a man at all, who identified as female or as neither male nor female and was expressing their inner self by wearing a dress. And again, both of those interpretations show us that identifying with a gender different from the one you were assigned at birth, whether for like a minute or an hour or a lifetime, was possible for Victorian people. And so the reason I wanted to think about it like that is because what that shows us is actually no matter how you interpret that story, it is a story that shows us that gender has never been something fixed or something unchallenged or something tied to the body in the way that we might think. Actually, it's always been open to disruption and challenge and play. No matter what label you stick on John Sullivan, that story tells us something interesting and something more radical than we might expect about the history of gender. So, does that mean we should describe John as a trans person? Now, I don't think so. And that's not necessarily because I don't think that John would describe themselves as trans if they were alive today. They might. But it's because they didn't describe themselves in that way in real historical terms in the past. And I believe really passionately in the importance of showing people in the past respect and care. And part of that is not describing them in terms that they wouldn't use to describe themselves. That's important for people in the past, and it's probably 100 times more important for people from cultures that we don't share who might describe themselves in their own cultural terms, which I'll say a bit more about later. It's important to say, though, that goes for not just refusing to call people trans in the past, it also goes for not necessarily calling people men or women or cisgender or heterosexual in the past if they didn't use those words about themselves either. Because we don't have a record of John using any of those words to describe himself, actually. And so truly refusing to describe a past person in modern terms also involves refusing those. So John, I think, was not a trans person, but I do think their story is trans history. And that distinction between trans people and trans history is for me a really important one, the really kind of essential thing that I wanted to get across in this book, because describing a historical record or a historical episode as trans history, it doesn't label individuals, but it does show us that this is history which gives us evidence of the disruption of normative categories of gender and sexuality, and which shows us that gender has never been as simple as being determined by biological characteristics. And in this political context, I think it's really, really important that we talk about the existence of that. Now, of course, thinking about trans history in that big, expansive way, saying trans history is not just individuals who conform to all these tick boxes, but it's the history of gender being disrupted in any way, that is not without its risks. And this is where I wanted to bring in a bit of York's own history, because I want to tell you another story that is part of the origin story of this book, which is probably a story that a lot of you will know. Now, in 2017, as part of my work with the York LGBT History Month charity, I became involved with a committee to get a permanent rainbow plaque established for Anne Lister. You might well have seen this plaque. For anyone who has somehow managed, to live in the city and not find out who Anne Lister was, Anne was a Yorkshire landowner in the 18th and early 19th century, famous for writing coded diary entries about having relationships with women. Anne went to school in York at King's Manor, obviously now part of the university, and also got married to Anne Walker in Holy Trinity Church on Gudrungate. I've got a picture of that, I think I have, yes. In 1834. And Anne also presented in a gender non-conforming way, got the nickname Gentleman Jack from local people, and recorded what I think are some quite interestingly complex feelings about gender in their diaries, including feeling uncomfortable when partners did certain things during sex because, there's a quote up there, "She lets me see too much that she considers me too much as a woman." That wasn't how Anne wanted to be understood in relationship terms. So, in 2017, the idea was to work with York Civic Trust to put up a plaque at Holy Trinity Church which marked the marriage between Anne Lister and Anne Walker. Now, without rehashing that process loads or throwing anyone under the bus, the process of getting the first permanent plaque established for Anne, it was rushed and it didn't reach the right people in consultation, and there ended up being a lot of argument and contestation about whether Anne should be referred to as a lesbian, which is not a word Anne used, but which would honour the fact that Anne was very open about attraction to women, and that Anne is really important to a lot of lesbians, or whether Anne should be referred to as gender non-conforming, which is more kind of a description of how someone lived, not an identity label, but then also doesn't address sexuality or relationships with women. And ultimately, we have plaque version 1 and plaque version 2 here. Quite a lot of differences. I won't go into all of them. People want to ask about how we went from marital commitments to took sacrament. That was a whole other conversation. But you'll notice that only one of those words, the word lesbian, is the one that ended up on the final plaque. And the reason I wanted to talk about this process is because this is one of the key things that fed into the writing of this book, because I wanted to think about whether there was a better way of handling that disagreement. What that process ended up with is essentially lesbians and trans or gender non-conforming people being positioned as sort of fighting over Anne, like only one of you can have Anne as a representative of your history, only one of you can claim Anne as a gender non-conforming person or as a lesbian. And I really wanted to ask, is there not a better way of doing this? Could we not take a step back and understand that emotional connection to history is not necessarily a zero-sum game? That lesbians feeling attached to Anne should not take away from gender non-conforming people also feeling an equal amount of attachment? And so, when I was writing Before We Were Trans, there were a few kind of key points that I wanted to make, as well as making the point that contemporary, narrow ideas about what it means to be really trans are affecting the way we do history in a way that's really restrictive. I also wanted to argue that instead of thinking about our past in terms of claiming historical figures for one group or another, we could instead try thinking about our emotional connection to the past in terms of community. So where we don't pretend that we're the same as everyone who we feel a sense of community with, and we don't pretend that someone's only allowed to be a member of one community at once. And that, in essence, that we really find a way of refusing this capitalist idea of history where everyone only gets to have one piece of it. Actually, that's not how history has to act at all. Now, that kind of last point about how we navigate our feelings around trans history, that was incredibly crucial for me as well, because the thing is that those emotional connections are central to the way that all queer people really engage with the past. And in a way, you know, I've been talking about origin stories for this book. There is another origin story for this book, and it starts when I was 14 years old. And to introduce that, I wanted to just do one more reading from the book, which is a slightly longer section from the epilogue. Okay. In writing this book, I've often been confronted by what the writer and philosopher Hill Malatino calls the irreducible alterity of people in the past. The fact that some histories of gender are not possible to map onto or relate to the way people experience gender today. Malatino characterises the acknowledgement of this irreducible alterity as a form of care for those past people, an idea that speaks deeply to me. It struck me when I first read it how different this framing of care was from the arguments historians more commonly make against describing people in the past as trans, that it's presentist, that it's anachronistic, that it inappropriately fixes past people in modern categories. And these arguments have rarely seemed to me to come from a place of care for people in the past. Instead, their priority seems to be history, or historiographical methodology as a kind of abstract, faux objective entity. And still more rarely do they seem to acknowledge the concurrent urgency of caring for people in the present, the people who are living now, experiencing and articulating their gender in manifold ways, and drawing strength from the histories of people who've done the same. Might it not be possible to find ways of recognising the essential difference of people in the past, people who disrupted gender before we were trans, while simultaneously holding space for the feelings of identification with them held by people in the present, the people who are trans now? In her book, My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, Jen Shapland writes of how, and I quote, queer histories often take the form of lists of calling out and naming kindred spirits. But she notes that this practice has largely gone out of vogue, as labelling a person's gender or sexual identity, past or present, is fraught with complexities. While acknowledging these complexities and the problems with what the historian Laura Doan has called genealogical approaches to queer histories, Shapland writes, "There's a part of me, a defiant and somewhat juvenile part, that still wants the list." She follows this chapter not with a list of historical lesbians per se, but with a nod to it, a list of Carson's possible girlfriends. I have never read a better, truer account of the experience of being a queer person writing queer history than Shapland's book. From the way that identification with historical figures can be a powerful trigger for self-realisation, to the unapologetic reclamation of a non-objective queer perspective, I felt consistently seen by it. I was frustrated by the review it got in The Observer, in which Rachel Cook mocked Shapland's tautologous statement that, for me, Carson's words are her words, missing the point Shapland's making, that most previous biographers have not taken Carson McCullers at her word. And Cook also argued that her over-identification with McCullers takes us nowhere that is very productive. What Cook seemed to miss, what in fact she may have been unable to appreciate, is just how much it matters for people who've been persistently told we have no history when we find historical figures who feel like us. Like Shapland, I came to identification with the queer past before I came to full articulation of my queer present. I knew that I felt deep hurt and anger about past injustices against queer men, and deep emotional identification with them, long before I realised that that was one aspect of my trans experience. And I have no doubt that my identification with them was what Cook calls over-identification. To spend 2 days doing nothing but staring at the walls of my university room and angstily reading A.E. Housman was surely to carry the discipline of history beyond the bounds of all that was seemly and proper. But it's through such indecorous emotion that history has provided me with some of the most intensely important experiences of my life. This is why it was so important to me to insist that the stories in this book are trans history. They are histories of gender not being binary or fixed or tied to the body. They show there have been always people who disrupt these norms, and there have always been societies in which they aren't norms at all. These people might not be like me. I might not be able to speak of them even equivocally as trans people, but they are people I can relate to nonetheless. In Malatino's words, they're a history that somehow slant rhymes with your present. These people, these stories, are not part of trans history alone. It seems quite likely, for example, that Shapland and I might feel the same way about some of the same historical people who are part of both trans history and lesbian history. But I have faith that our communities are expansive enough to hold both of these meanings alongside each other, to recognise that one person's attachment to a history does not diminish our own. The discipline of history isn't supposed to leave much room for emotion. We're supposed to be ruthlessly objective, dispassionately surveying the evidence, though I hope I've shown in this book that anyone who thinks they're doing this, at least where the history of gender is concerned, is kidding themselves. Both my background in literary scholarship and my personality make me a liability in this regard, and I'm glad. It's easy to assume that emotional engagement leads to bad history, to riding roughshod over the experiences of people in the past and having regard only for our own feelings. But for me, emotional connection to those past people is not just tolerable, it's necessary, because it's what leads us to care enough to take the time to know people in other times and cultures on their own gendered terms. It's what leads us to remember that those people are people, deserving of a humanising historiography that declines to display their bodies to the world and works determinedly to oppose the racist ideologies that have long tried to deny them humanity. In this sense, I think identification and community with people of the past takes us somewhere very productive indeed. It's productive of solidarity, of care, of a new, trans-affirming, anti-racist, liberating way of doing history. A trans gaze can be an incredibly productive historiographical tool. A trans gaze is what allows us to look at a case of historical gender nonconformity and remain open to the full spectrum of possibilities that it represents. A trans gaze is what allows us to read about an individual wearing a mixture of male and female coded clothing and ask, but what did that feel like? A trans gaze is what allows us to accept and take seriously the fact that a person's gender can be a spiritual or sexual experience in a way we can't empathise with. Or indeed that sometimes what looks like gender isn't at all. Because we know firsthand how it feels when people don't take seriously how we articulate ourselves. This is the gaze that I hope will continue to transform the way we think about the past. Now, as I kind of alluded to in that passage, I said the story of Before We Were Trans sort of, in some ways, starts when I was a teenager. And it really does. It starts when I was sort of about 14, slowly starting the 10-year process of figuring out my queer identity through connection with the queer past. And I ended up doing a PhD on this guy, 14th century King Edward II. That's the other much more expensive book that I wrote. It's an academic book about Edward II. Edward II had a reputation for having sex with his male favourites, and so I was investigating how that reputation developed, how it evolved after his death. And at that point, at the point of starting the PhD, I was still sort of kidding myself that I was a really enthusiastic queer ally. But then when I joined the York LGBT History Month group, I sort of felt so uncomfortable about not being able to explain to people why I was there that it pushed me to work through my feelings and actually come out as trans in 2014. And the reason I'm telling you this is because of what happened as part of the LGBT History Month work. So as a big part of my PhD research, I was really committed to making the point that Edward II was not gay or bisexual. And I stand by that point. Like, he was a guy from the 14th century. He didn't have those words. He understood sexuality in a totally different way from me. It's not for me to kind of patronise him by saying, oh, he was really gay, he just didn't know it yet. But when I, as part of the LGBT History Month work, when I gave talks about what research I was doing, it was gay men, and particularly older gay men, who were most interested in hearing what I had to say. And they did not want to hear Edward II was not gay or bi. They wanted to hear, this man in the 14th century was like you. There have always been people like you. And as a kind of young, naive PhD student, my first response to that reaction was like to be frustrated and to think, oh, historians just need to communicate better, that we can't put people from the past in today's boxes. And everyone around me in the academic history community was very much encouraging me in that view. Like, academic history is full of people lamenting that the public have feelings about the past and disavowing those feelings and arguing that they lead us astray. But the longer I spent with people who wanted to think about Edward II as gay or bi, the longer I realised that telling people not to have feelings wasn't really going to get me anywhere. People were going to have feelings, and that wasn't a thing that I could do anything about. And instead I thought, you know, we might as well think about what to do with the feelings that we have about the past. So, like, given that we do have feelings about the past, given that we do want to find people in the past who are like us, whether we're queer or not, how do we start doing history in a way that kind of accepts those things, rather than just shouting into the wind about how they shouldn't exist? And is there anything about those feelings that might be a positive, rather than an inconvenient truth for us to work around? What can emotional connection to history do for us? And as I said in my reading, what I argue in this book is that dealing honestly and reflectively with the feelings that we've got about history can actually be productive for historians. It can help us to develop an ethics of care in which to root our historical practice. Now, you might also have noticed, when I was reading that section from the epilogue, is that I also argued that that ethics of care can help us to develop an anti-racist stance on history. And this is another really important aspect of this book, and this is kind of the last thing that I want to spend a few minutes talking about. How I approach the kind of global scope of the book. It's when the New York Times reviewed this book, the first thing the reviewer did was say, this book attempts an impossible thing, which is that, it's attempting to tell a global history of gender nonconformity. They were very nice about the book overall, but they were absolutely right that telling a global history of gender nonconformity is an impossible thing to do. But what concerned me most about writing a book with a global scope was not so much that it was too big to fit it all in. I knew that I wanted to tell a selection of case studies rather than telling a big grand narrative anyway. But was the ethics of doing that as a white person. Because I knew I wanted to avoid falling into the traps that white trans people often fall into when we talk about gender non-conforming people from cultures that aren't our own, which is partly we very often impose a white Western gaze on terminology, and that includes the word trans, onto cultures that don't use that. But we also do that thing, especially white non-binary people do this, when we get very excited in a sort of fetishistic way about other people's genders that aren't male or female, and then we use them to prove the validity of our own. We say things like, obviously gender isn't binary because two spirit people exist and hydras exist. And then we stop, having taken as much from those two spirit people and hydras as we wanted without taking any time to understand their realities or to think about what people in those communities are fighting for and how we might give back and whether they ever asked to be kind of instrumentalized for our cause. And I really wanted to write a book that was not just doing that. So one way I approached that was to argue for the interconnectedness of trans activism and anti-racism and the importance of doing trans history in an anti-racist way. And this meant, first of all, working to expose the way that not only the gender binary, but also the sex binary comes out of racist and eugenicist thought in European culture. Like, the reason we think about biological sex as binary today is because the idea of sex as binary was developed through the idea that white people's bodies were the most perfectly divided into two sexes. And we still see the legacy of that in that what we think of as a normative male body or a normative female body is according to white norms. If you look at the people who get their sex questioned in sport, for example, it's overwhelmingly black people particularly. So it was important for me to expose that. It was important for me to also try to show what I think it means to write anti-racist trans history, which is about understanding people's experiences on their own cultural terms and also calling attention to the hugely significant role that European colonialism has played in shaping people's gendered experiences, in restricting some experiences and reshaping others. Now, when I started the research for this book, I sort of assumed that I'd find a similar story across the parts of the world that were colonized by white Europeans. So I thought I'd find that there were lots of diverse gendered experiences, and then those were all suppressed by the kind of imposition of white Christian gender roles and hierarchies and binaries. And in some places, that is exactly what I found. But in other places, it also wasn't that simple. So, for example, the first chapter of the book starts with the story of a West African monarch called Njinga Mbande. And have I got a picture of them? Njinga lived in what Europeans call the 17th century, and they lived in the kingdom of Ndongo, which is part of Angola now. And they were assigned female at birth, and their experience in relation to that was kind of really not straightforward. So, like, on the one hand, they got an excellent education, both physical and intellectual. They became known for what their society considered masculine interests, like law and military strategy. But they also suffered a lot of abuse and oppression because of their reproductive capacity. They were forcibly sterilized by their brother. They had one of their children murdered because their brother was afraid that Njinga would have children who would challenge his claim to the throne. Njinga himself initially was not seen as a potential rival monarch. So in Ndongo, people seem to have understood that people assigned female at birth could be masculine in some ways, in their interests, but not that they could rule the country. But Njinga actually defied these expectations, and once their brother's grip on power got a bit shaky, they managed to seize the throne themselves. And once they were on that throne, they ruled not as queen, but as king. So, did Njinga ask to be called king so that their subjects would take them seriously and accept that they had authority? Or was it the other way around? You know, they seized the throne and their subjects were like, well, only men are monarchs, so this one must be a king after all. There is huge precedent for that way of thinking within West African culture, not just in history, but also today. In Igbo, Nigeria, for example, Ekwe people are people assigned female at birth who own land and marry women and rule their families and are consequently understood as men. And that form of gender nonconformity has a long history, despite the attempts of Christian missionaries to eradicate it. So that might be closer to what's going on. But the complicating factor with Njinga is they weren't just kind of fashioning their gender in relation to their own culture, they were also having to deal with Portuguese colonizers at the same time. And their first political role, before they came to the throne, was as a diplomatic envoy to the Portuguese. They essentially spent the rest of their life either fighting them or negotiating treaties with them, both to defend the integrity of their kingdom and to secure the release of their sisters from hostage captivity. And the Portuguese, of course, they came from a Christian culture where hierarchy was conflated with maleness. They were going to take someone more seriously if they were male. So being understood as male was also a really big strategic advantage for Njinga in those negotiations. And so when you're telling that story, when you're looking at that history, without testimony about gender from Njinga, it's completely impossible to separate out which of their gendered decisions were made in response to their own culture and which one of them were made in response to colonial violence. taking histories like Njinga's on their own cultural terms, so like saying this person became male because they were a monarch, that's a challenge for me, because it requires letting go of the logic that it is somehow anti-feminist to think like that. Because, in my own culture, saying to rule is automatically to be male would be offensive. But in Njinga's culture, it wasn't offensive, it was just true. And in fact, it is just as anti-feminist, way more so, arguably, to deny someone's autonomy to determine what they say their gender is. So writing a global trans history was not an easy thing to do, either logistically or ethically. But emphasising both the impact of colonialism on the story of people like Njinga and the importance of taking their gendered histories on their own cultural terms, even if that sometimes feels weird and uncomfortable, felt like, to me, the most ethically responsible way of trying to do that. And that was important to me because history can so easily be used for violent purposes. But it was also important to me because I know that history has the capacity to be used for non-violent purposes. Doing history is never a neutral process. It can do so much harm, but it can also do good. And really it's the hope of that doing good that motivated me in writing this. Because most of all, I think, doing this kind of history of gender, showing us that gender has always been open to challenge and disruption and play and experimentation, that's not just liberating for trans people, I think that's liberating for everybody. So I'll end on that note. I had a slide that said questions, but if anyone has any questions, really please answer them. Thank you.
Okay, well, I've got a question for Kit. So this is one I just thought of just now as you're speaking. Recently I read an article about Louisa May Alcott. Was this on your mind when you were reading the book, or is this something that's new, that's kind of new discovery since then?
So I read about, for people who don't know, there is some evidence that Louisa May Alcott identified as male part or all of the time, writer of Little Women. Also, there's another name they use, but I forget which it is. So that news sort of broke while I was in the process of writing the book, which is one of the reasons that they're not in there, although there's many, many, many people who aren't in the book, as I said. I find it really interesting, though, because it tells a really different story from the kind of... from the way that people have more often thought about gender nonconformity in relation to 19th century authors, which has been 19th century authors who were assigned female at birth and used male names to publish their writing. There's a lot of debate about that, about what names we should refer to those people by, like George Eliot, for example, should we refer to them as George Eliot? And what names we should use, what pronouns we should use, whether it is more anti-feminist to deny that women can write books or to deny the agency of these individual women or people to use whatever names they want to use. George Eliot is a really interesting case who, my editor cut this out because it was too long, but because in George Eliot's diaries, they refer to the person George Eliot with he, him pronouns. So when they're talking about George Eliot, they talk about George Eliot in the third person and they use he, but when they're talking about themselves, they use she. So when we're talking about George Eliot, maybe we should use he for George Eliot to respect that. I'm not sure, but I think it's really interesting. But Louisa May Alcott, obviously different in that they published under a woman's name, but seem to privately have used a man's one at some times. So I would love to see people do more research on that, and particularly think about it through a trans lens that really tries to get to the heart of, again, seeing Louisa or whatever the name we might use on their own terms. Yeah.
Thank you. Have we got any more? Got any questions in the in-person audience? Yes.
Hi, Kit. Earlier in your, presentation, you talked about kind of having emotion in historical writing being a liability, and historians should be kind of very objective in their methods, and kind of throughout history that is very prominent. How do you think kind of this could be transformed into not necessarily a liability, but a strength in historical writing for the future?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. I think that idea of historians have to be objective and emotionless is based on the fallacy that that's possible. And when you look at who is accused of being unobjective, it's overwhelmingly marginalised people writing marginalised histories because we're not perceived to be objective enough, whereas people from non-marginalised groups writing histories of those non-marginalised groups are perceived to be able to be perfectly objective. So there's a clear, real double standard there. So it starts with acknowledging that we can never be objective, and then it starts with thinking about, okay, what does that subjectivity do for us as a strength? And so, yeah, I argue in the book, and would argue in any context, that I think feeling a sense of connection to a person in the past can be a really powerful motivator to take their experiences seriously and write about them humanely. One of the things I didn't talk about in my presentation was there's a chapter on the relationship between trans and intersex histories, and that's a quite different sort of ethical relation to in a lot of the chapters I'm sort of fighting to say these are trans histories, and in the trans and intersex chapter I'm sort of saying these are trans histories, but we mustn't forget that a lot of them are also intersex histories, because trans people are very good at sort of erasing that aspect of history. And one of the other things that happens with intersex history a lot is that intersex people's bodies get described in really graphic ways that aren't kind of necessary or humanising, and so I think one of the places that emotional connection goes is saying, would you like that? If someone said that about you? And then that can lead to a different kind of historical approach, as well as, I think just being reflective about our own positionality in a way that, like, social scientists are quite good at, but historians are appalling, and we should learn some things.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Yes?
So you spoke a bit about the global sort of geographical perspective that you were taking. Could you talk a bit about the historical side of that? So what the sort of time period that you're looking at in the book is, and whether your sort of methodologies in doing trans history research changed depending on the chronological period that you were looking at in each case study?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. So it's very much not a chronological book, it's thematic. So, the first chapter is on trans histories and social roles. There's a chapter, as I said, on trans and intersex history, etc., etc. But the earliest history in the book is ancient Egyptian, and the most recent goes up to sort of, think about the 70s. But there's a few sort of contemporary things thrown in as well. And there's probably a bias towards the early modern period, because that's my actual historical specialism. You're right that the methodology had to be incredibly different. Really, the best way to approach this, I found, was to first get a sense of what a given society thought about gender, and then look for instances of those rules being broken. So, yeah, what was the established understanding of gender? Was it binary? Did it require wearing certain clothes? All that kind of thing. And then look for the edge cases. And sometimes that meant you needed specific terminology. I did a lot of looking for quote-unquote hermaphrodites, for example, not just to look for intersex people in the historical record, but also because in the 16th and 17th century, people would accuse people of looking like hermaphrodites if they were just a woman with a man's hat on. So once you'd figured out kind of what the right terminology was, then that was something you could look for. It was also, I should say, very methodologically affected by writing it exclusively in 2020 and 2021. There probably would have been some more travelling that had been involved, although the very nice thing about that period was a lot of archives made a lot more of their digital collections accessible on a temporary basis, and therefore probably made researching these histories a lot more accessible. And I think one of the things we need to do now is fight for that not to go backwards, as it's assumed that people can travel again, because also from a climate change perspective, it was great not to have to go to the US to look at a manuscript. I could just look it on the internet. So yeah, that's off topic, but I think green methodologies in writing also important.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
And do we have any questions on Zoom? Or one, at the back.
In writing your book, which area did you find the most interesting, or maybe exciting to research, in the sense of it may went beyond what you already assumed going into it?
Oh, thank you for asking. That's so tough. So the last chapter of the book is about the relationship between spirituality and gender, and people's gender nonconformity being inherently spiritual. So that involved researching the really wide diversity of different kinds of two-spirit identities for a lot of that, and the interesting and challenging thing about researching that, and this is probably something I didn't expect, was I sort of thought, there's a lot of bad histories of two-spirit people, which are from a anthropological perspective about which sort of reads everyone's gender through a sexual lens and a sexual deviance lens. And so I sort of thought maybe I can just look at the sources that those people used and reinterpret them through a more sympathetic lens. But what I hadn't reckoned with was the really deep legacy of not just European colonialism generally, but the residential school system in the US and Canada, where a lot of Indigenous, First Nations, Native American people were sent forcibly to what were effectively re-education schools run by the European colonisers, and that had incredibly affected attitudes among those communities. So then when researchers went back to them and said, tell us about the Two-Spirit people, they'd be like, oh yeah, they were awful, they were perverted, they were anti-Christian, because they'd been kind of indoctrinated. So it was then, that was a really interesting but challenging process of having to reckon with the fact that you're never necessarily going to get a complete picture of the extent to which these people had enjoyed respect before that residential school process happened. But when you could, there were some amazing people. Like one of the stories I tell in that chapter is of a Kootenai person who, I talk about them mainly because they transformed into a man partway through their life after a spiritual vision, but also they walked the entire length of the Columbia River in North America, which is like 1,000 miles, and is something that most hikers would not do today, and they just kind of did it. And so that was also just really inspiring to read about the resilience and experiences of people like that.
Chris, do we have any questions on Zoom?
I think due to the technical issues,
oh no,
had a bit of disruption in terms of questions, but we have. There is one question. Sorry, we do have one. Kit, you mentioned that ancestors claimed by trans people and lesbians almost on an exclusively exclusionary basis between those two communities. How can society be more inclusionary without excluding groups? I've recently got into a discussion about whether pregnant people is a better term, but that seems to exclude or at least detract from womanhood.
Yeah, so that's a big question, which I guess is partly about history and partly about terminology today. I find it really interesting that on the one hand, feminism is framed as the radical notion that women are people, but on the other hand, the moment you start to call women people, that's an erasure of a kind. But if people feel really strongly about that, I also think there's nothing wrong with saying women and other pregnant people. And as someone with the capacity to be pregnant, I prefer not to be referred to as a woman, and person is fine. More generally, I think there's some work to do on reclaiming the word person as a truly gender-neutral term, or just listing lots of groups if you want to refer to lots of groups. But with history, I think it's just really important to recognise that we can talk about these histories through lots of lenses. I talked about Njinga Mbande primarily as a gender non-conforming person just then. There's also a brilliant TV series which presents them primarily as a woman, and there's nothing wrong with people reading these histories through different lenses and saying this is the aspect of this history that resonates most with me, as long as we don't say this is absolutely the only way to read this, and if you do it any other way you're wrong. And that's just never the case. It is always okay for individuals to identify with a particular historical episode and other individuals to do the same from a different angle. But I think what's really behind this a lot of the time is the fact that we all feel like history is a really scarce resource that we have to grab bits of because there's so few marginalised histories still talked about. The moment, a lesbian community finds one, they grab it with both hands. The moment the trans community finds one, they try to grab it with both hands too. And if we just talked about more diverse histories, then we wouldn't feel this sense of urgency to claim something just for ourselves, I think. So I think talking about these histories more is really one way that that will start to dissolve, and we'll start to be able to think about them in a more healthy way.
Okay, any more questions? All right, well, thank you very much for coming. Thanks for coming to talk to us, Kit. And have a great rest of your LGBT History Month.
Thank you.